What happens when trust is shattered beyond repair? Sophie's life is turned upside down after a betrayal, and now, with nothing left but regret, she must face the consequences of her choices. Will she ever find redemption, or is it too late for forgiveness? Dive into a story of love, loss, and the silent battles we fight within. Are you ready to see how it all unravels? Watch now to uncover the devastating truth. Jonathan McAllister stood outside his home, staring at the picture-perfect family portrait hanging on the wall just inside the front door. His eyes traced the smiling faces of him and his wife, Sophie, their arms wrapped around each other with their young daughter between them. To the world, they were the epitome of happiness. Successful careers, a beautiful house in suburban New Jersey, and a loving family. Everything seemed ideal. But as John gazed at the image, a sense of emptiness washed over him. He no longer recognized the couple in the photo. He turned his gaze away from the portrait and reached for the door handle, the heavy weight of his thoughts sinking deeper into his chest. Sophie had no idea that everything had already started to unravel. She was inside, completely unaware that the perfect life they had built together was on the verge of falling apart. John's heart raced with a mix of anger, betrayal, and confusion, but most of all, a gnawing sense of helplessness. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the television playing in the living room. Sophie was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, a faint smile on her lips. John paused for a moment, taking in the sight of her. The woman he once loved, the woman who had once been his world, now seemed so distant. He could feel his pulse quicken as his gaze fell to the phone in her hand. He didn't want to believe it, but the doubt had been growing inside him for weeks. The late nights at work, the phone calls that seemed too private, the way she avoided his questions about her whereabouts, it was all too much to ignore. But it wasn't until he found the text message from Mark Stevenson, her colleague, that everything changed. Mark's name had appeared on her phone screen, followed by a message that made John's stomach churn. "I'll see you tonight. Just the two of us, like old times." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind raced as he tried to process what he had just read. Was it a mistake? Was it just a harmless message about work? He didn't believe it for a second. John moved quietly through the house, his every step deliberate, as if trying not to disturb the fragile illusion that everything was fine. He hadn't confronted Sophie yet. He couldn't. The thought of confronting her with something so painful, so undeniable, was too much to bear. He needed time to think, to plan, to understand why things had gone so wrong. But most of all, he needed to be sure. As he reached the kitchen, John stopped and stared at the counter, his mind racing. He had always been a man who prided himself on his control. In his career, he was methodical, precise. But now, in his own home, he felt completely powerless. The woman he had trusted more than anyone in his life had betrayed him, and he had no idea how to confront it. He heard Sophie's voice from the living room. "John?" she called out, her voice light, almost too carefree. "What's wrong?" For a moment, John stood frozen. The sound of her voice, the familiar tone, made everything feel so normal. But it wasn't. Nothing was normal anymore. Everything he had built his life around, everything he thought he knew, was starting to crumble. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to steady his nerves. He had to play it smart. Sophie couldn't know that he knew. Not yet. He needed to gather more proof, watch her closely, and find out just how deep this betrayal ran. "Nothing," he finally replied, his voice calm and steady. "Just thinking." Sophie looked up from her phone, her eyes bright with curiosity. "About what?" John hesitated. His mind screamed at him to tell her the truth, to call out the lie, but instead he simply shook his head. "Just work stuff. Don't worry about it." Sophie nodded, her attention drifting back to her phone. John watched her for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth that was slowly coming to the surface. He knew this was just the beginning of the end, and he was determined to uncover every secret, to make sure he had all the facts before he acted. But as he walked away from her, a new feeling settled in his chest. Not just betrayal, but a deep, hollow pain. The kind of pain that came with the realization that the person you loved most in the world had been lying to you all along. John spent the next few days in a state of quiet observation. Sophie didn't suspect a thing. She continued with her usual routine, completely unaware that her husband had begun to piece together the truth. She would leave for work in the mornings, come back in the evenings, and they'd share meals together, sometimes exchanging pleasantries, other times barely speaking. But to John, it was all a carefully woven web of deceit that he could no longer ignore. Sophie's phone had become a beacon of lies. The texts, the calls, the constant messages from Mark, it was all right there just beneath the surface. John had learned to stay calm, to be patient, but every night as he lay awake beside her, the weight of her betrayal gnawed at him, the quiet rage rising like a tide he couldn't hold back. He thought about how everything had seemed so perfect. They were the couple everyone admired, successful, happy, with a beautiful daughter. But the cracks were showing now. The facade was breaking, and every word Sophie spoke felt like a rehearsed lie. As the days passed, John found himself doing something he never thought he'd do. He was tracking Sophie, checking her calendar, reviewing her emails, listening to her phone calls when she left the room. It was exhausting. The constant need to gather more information to confirm his suspicions was eating him alive, but he couldn't stop. Every new detail he uncovered about Sophie's lies pushed him further down this path of silence and calculation. One afternoon, as Sophie prepared lunch in the kitchen, John casually asked, "How was your meeting today?" Her eyes flickered for a second, just a fraction too long, but she quickly recovered. "Busy. Lots of things to handle," she replied, her voice too upbeat. He knew she was lying. He could see it in her face, in the way she avoided his gaze, in the way she fidgeted with the cutting board. John didn't press her for more details. He didn't need to. He already knew. He had seen the messages, the late-night texts, the plans to meet Mark. All of it was etched in his mind now, a picture that couldn't be erased. He had enough evidence, but instead of confronting her, he chose to remain calm, to stay silent. He would wait. Later that evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, John watched Sophie carefully. She smiled at him as if nothing was wrong, but the tension in her eyes told a different story. She knew. She must have known. The air between them was thick, filled with unspoken words, heavy with secrets neither of them dared to address. "John, are you okay?" Sophie asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost too soft. It wasn't the usual carefree tone she had when they were just enjoying a meal together. Something was different. She was trying too hard to act normal. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice colder than usual. He kept his gaze on his plate, avoiding her eyes. "Just tired, I guess." Sophie didn't push further. She didn't need to. Her mind was already racing. She knew something was wrong. Her heart had started to beat faster every time John looked at her with that blank, distant expression. But the worst part was, she didn't know how much he knew. Was he just suspicious? Had he found out everything? The uncertainty gnawed at her. She could feel the weight of it every time she tried to speak to him. As the night wore on, Sophie attempted a small gesture of normalcy. She placed a hand on John's, her fingers trembling slightly. "I know things have been a little off lately," she said quietly. "But we can fix this, right? We can—" John pulled his hand away gently, his expression unreadable. "It's not that simple," he replied, his voice tight. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. What did he mean by that? Was he speaking figuratively, or did he know? Her stomach twisted with fear. She tried to reach out to him again, but he stood up abruptly. "I'm going to bed," he muttered, leaving her sitting there alone, the silence between them louder than any argument could be. Sophie sat there for a long time, staring at her plate. Her thoughts spiraled. What had happened to the man she married? What had happened to them? And how could she fix this if everything was already broken? As John lay in bed, his back turned to her, Sophie's mind raced. She had no idea how deep this could go, how far John would let it go without confronting her. But one thing was certain. He knew. He knew everything. The days passed slowly, and John's silence became a constant presence in the house. Sophie noticed the subtle changes in his behavior, his distant gaze, his lack of engagement in their conversations, the absence of the warmth he once had. It was as if a wall had been built between them, an invisible barrier she couldn't cross. She couldn't figure out what had happened, what had caused this shift in him. Was it her? Had her lies finally caught up with her? Or was there something more? She didn't know, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. Every time she reached out to him, he pulled away. Every time she tried to bridge the gap, he stepped further back. At night, when they lay in bed together, Sophie would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to think of ways to fix things. She wanted to talk to him, to explain herself, to beg for forgiveness, but she was terrified that if she spoke the truth, it would only drive him further away. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, Sophie tried again. She placed her hand on John's, gently brushing his fingers, the touch tender, almost pleading. "John," she whispered, her voice shaky. "What's going on with us? Why do you seem so distant?" John didn't pull his hand away this time, but he didn't look at her either. His eyes were fixed on the space in front of him, his expression unreadable. "I'm just tired, Sophie," he muttered, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We both are." Sophie's heart dropped. She knew it wasn't just exhaustion. It was something deeper, something that had changed between them, something she couldn't understand. "John," she pressed, her voice more urgent now. "If I did something to upset you, I need to know. I want to fix it. Please." John's gaze shifted toward her, his eyes colder than she remembered. "You've already done enough," he replied, his words cutting through the air like a knife. He let out a breath, as if he was trying to hold back something. "You think you can fix everything, but you can't. Not this time." The sting of his words hit her hard, but she refused to let him see how much it hurt. Instead, she tried to keep her voice steady. "John, I don't understand. Please, just tell me what I've done." He didn't respond immediately. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Sophie could feel her pulse racing, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't know if it was because of fear or something else, but she had the distinct feeling that whatever was left between them was slipping away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John spoke, his voice low and controlled. "I know about you and Mark." Sophie froze. The blood drained from her face, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Her mind raced, searching for a response, an explanation, but there was nothing. The truth was out. He knew. "You know?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her throat felt dry, like she couldn't breathe. How long have you known?" John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her for the first time that night, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "Long enough to know that everything you've been telling me is a lie." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to deny it, to tell him that he was wrong, but she couldn't. The guilt was too much to bear, and the realization that John had known all along crushed her. I didn't mean for it to happen," she stammered, her voice breaking. "It just happened, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, John." But John didn't say anything. He just stared at her, his face unreadable. Sophie could feel the weight of his silence, and it was worse than any words he could have said. The silence spoke volumes, and it was suffocating her. "You're sorry," he repeated, his tone mocking now. "You're sorry for what? For betraying me? For destroying everything we built together? You don't get to apologize, Sophie. Not this time." The harshness in his voice shocked her. She had never heard him sound so cold, so distant, and the worst part was, she knew he was right. She had destroyed everything, and now she had nothing left. Sophie wanted to cry, to beg him to forgive her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just sat there, staring at him, unable to find a way back to the person she once was. And John? He just stared back, his eyes empty, his heart already closed off. The silence between John and Sophie was unbearable. John had just revealed that he knew about her affair with Mark. Sophie sat frozen, her mind racing, trying to process the words that had just shattered her world. She had thought she could keep the lie going, that somehow she could patch things up before he ever found out. But now, the truth was out, and there was no going back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sophie tried to breathe, tried to find the words to explain herself, but nothing came. She felt like she was drowning in the weight of her guilt. Her thoughts were a blur, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted to hurt John, but she had, and now she had to face the consequences. John stood across from her, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. Sophie couldn't read him anymore. The man she had once known so well, his warmth, his kindness, the way he had loved her, was gone. In his place stood a stranger, a man who had been betrayed by the one person he had trusted most in the world. "You have no idea how much this hurts, Sophie," John said, his voice low and calm, but filled with so much pain that it made Sophie's chest tighten. "I trusted you. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away." Sophie opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She had no defense, no excuse that could make this right. Her betrayal was unforgivable, and deep down she knew that. "You think you can apologize and make it all go away?" John continued, his voice hardening. "But it's too late for that. You've broken something that can't be fixed." Sophie's eyes welled with tears. "I never meant for it to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was a mistake, a huge mistake, and I'm so sorry, John. I never wanted to hurt you. Please try to understand." But John wasn't looking for understanding. He wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was looking for closure. The pain in his eyes told her that he had already made up his mind. "You can't undo what you've done," he said coldly, his gaze never leaving hers. "And I'm done, Sophie. I'm done pretending like everything is fine. We're done." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had known deep down that this day would come, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. John was done with her. Their marriage, the life they had built together, was over. "I'm sorry," she repeated, her voice breaking. She could feel the tears slipping down her cheeks now, but she didn't wipe them away. She deserved them. She had ruined everything. She had let her own selfish desires destroy the only good thing she had ever had. John shook his head, his jaw clenched. "You're sorry? That's not enough, Sophie. It's never going to be enough. Not after what you've done." Sophie felt like her whole world was falling apart. Her hands trembled as she reached out toward him, desperate for some sign that he still cared. "Please, John, please don't do this. I love you. I never stopped loving you." John stepped back, his face hardening. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. If you loved me, you wouldn't have betrayed me like this. I can't look at you the same way anymore. I can't trust you anymore." The words were like daggers, and Sophie felt each one slice through her. She had destroyed everything. The life she had with John, the trust they had built, gone in an instant. "I have been living with this, knowing that you've been lying to me, and I never said a word," John continued, his voice quieter now, tinged with something close to regret. "But I can't do this anymore, Sophie. I can't live in this lie." Sophie's hands went to her face, her sobs uncontrollable now. "Please," she begged. "Please don't leave me. I'll fix this. I swear I'll do anything. Just don't leave me." But John was already shaking his head, his decision made. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice firm. "You've already made your choice. You chose him over me." Sophie felt the finality in his words. She knew he was right. She had chosen Mark. She had chosen to throw away everything they had for a fleeting moment of excitement, a moment that had ruined everything. John turned away, his back now to her. Sophie reached out, her voice breaking. "John, please, don't go. Don't leave me." He didn't turn back. He didn't look at her. "Goodbye, Sophie," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of finality. "I hope one day you can live with what you've done." And with that, he was gone. The days after John's revelation felt like a long, drawn-out suffocation for Sophie. He had left. He had finally walked away, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of their life together. She had tried to hold on to him, tried to fix things, but it was too late. The silence between them spoke louder than any words ever could. Every moment felt like a battle that Sophie was losing. John didn't say anything more to her, didn't give her the satisfaction of an explanation or a final fight. He had closed the door, and the weight of his indifference crushed her more than any argument ever could. She could still see his face, the way he looked at her with such coldness, the way his voice sounded when he told her it was over. "You've already made your choice," he had said, And she knew it was true. She had chosen Mark over him, and now she was paying the price. But the worst part wasn't his anger. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was the silence. John's refusal to engage with her, to say anything more, made her feel invisible, like she didn't matter anymore. He didn't fight for her. He didn't scream at her. He simply left. Sophie spent her days in a haze. Her work, once something she was passionate about, now felt pointless. She could barely focus on anything. All she could think about was John, what he was doing, where he was. Was he happy? Was he finally free from the mess she had made of their lives? She had tried calling him, sending messages, begging for just one more conversation. But each attempt was met with nothing but silence. John had completely shut her out, and it hurt. More than she could ever explain. She couldn't help but wonder if he had been preparing to leave long before he actually did. Had he known the whole time? Did he know she was lying? Or had she just finally pushed him too far? The guilt was suffocating. She thought back to the last few months, to the way things had been. She had tried to ignore the cracks in their relationship, tried to believe that everything was fine. But deep down, she had known. She had known that something was wrong. She had ignored the signs, lied to herself, and now she was facing the consequences. Every day, Sophie would go through the motions, getting up, going to work, coming home, all while feeling like she was drowning in her own regret. She knew she had to face the reality. She had ruined everything. There was no turning back. Then one evening, as she sat on the couch alone, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from Mark. "I think we need to talk." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the message for a moment, uncertainty flooding her mind. She didn't want to see him. She didn't want to face the man who had been her escape, who had helped her destroy everything she had with John. But she couldn't ignore the message. With shaking hands, she typed a quick reply. "What about?" "It's not working. I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." Sophie felt the breath leave her body. She had known, deep down, that Mark was never going to stick around. He was just a fleeting distraction, a momentary escape from her guilt and her failing marriage. But to see him walk away too felt like another blow she didn't know if she could survive. She stared at the screen, the finality of his words echoing in her mind. "I can't do this anymore." He was done. He had used her just as much as she had used him, and now he was leaving, just like John had. Tears welled up in her eyes as the reality of her situation hit her. She was completely alone, no one to turn to, no one to confide in. She had pushed everyone away, and now the silence between her and John had been replaced with the emptiness that came from losing everything. She sank back into the couch, her body feeling heavy. The war inside her raged on. She didn't know how to fight this anymore. She didn't know how to make things right. But deep down, she knew that it was too late. She had lost. And now, all she had left was the silence of her own guilt. Sophie stood at the window, her hands trembling as she watched the rain fall in sheets outside. It had been days since Mark's message, and yet it still echoed in her mind. He was gone. The fleeting comfort she had found in him was over. The silence between her and John was suffocating, and she could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest. She had spent the last few days in a haze, trying to wrap her mind around everything that had happened. The guilt, the regret, the constant ache in her heart. It was all consuming. She had lost her marriage. She had lost John. And now even Mark, the man she thought might offer her some escape, had abandoned her. The truth of her actions hit her with a force she wasn't ready for, and she had no idea how to move forward. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, breaking the silence. Sophie glanced at the screen. It was a message from John. For a moment, she just stared at it, unable to move. She hadn't heard from him in days. He had gone silent, and she feared the worst. But there it was, his name flashing on the screen. "We need to talk." Her heart dropped into her stomach. She had been waiting for this moment, yet the reality of it felt like a punch in the gut. What could he possibly want to say to her now? What was left to say? She had already betrayed him in every way possible. Was there any way to make things right? Sophie quickly typed a response, her hands shaking. "Please, John, I'm so sorry. I don't know what else to say." She waited, her breath caught in her throat as the seconds ticked by. Finally, her phone buzzed again. His reply came quickly, almost too quickly. "Meet me at the cafe in 30 minutes. Sophie felt a surge of anxiety. She had no idea what this conversation would be, but she knew it couldn't be good. She had already lost him once. What if this time it was for good? She grabbed her coat and left the house, her mind racing as she drove to the cafe. When Sophie arrived, she spotted John sitting at a corner table, his face unreadable. He looked tired, worn down by the weight of everything that had happened. His eyes met hers as she approached, and for a brief moment they locked gazes. There was no anger in his eyes, no rage, just a deep, heavy sadness. Sophie felt her throat tighten as she sat across from him. "John," she whispered, barely able to speak. "I've been waiting for this. I've been so afraid of this moment, but I'm ready. I'm ready to hear whatever you have to say." John's expression remained neutral as he folded his hands in front of him. He didn't speak for a long time, and the silence between them was unbearable. Sophie felt the urge to fill it, to beg him for forgiveness, to explain herself one last time, but she knew it wouldn't help. She had run out of words. Finally, John spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't know what I was expecting from you, Sophie. I don't know why I thought it would get better." He paused, his gaze hardening. "But I know one thing for sure. This isn't love. What we had, it's gone now. I can't look at you the same way anymore." Sophie felt a sharp pain in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The finality in his voice was suffocating. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a goodbye. John continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I gave you everything. I trusted you, and you chose him. You chose the lies. You chose the betrayal." He let out a breath, his eyes glistening with the hurt he had been carrying. "I can't keep living in this. I can't keep pretending like nothing's wrong. It's too late for us, Sophie." Sophie's heart shattered. This was the truth she had feared, the truth she had known deep down but hadn't wanted to face. John was done. There was nothing left for her to say, nothing left to fix. She had broken everything, and there was no going back. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, "I never meant for it to end like this. I never wanted to hurt you, John. I'm so sorry. Please believe me." Her voice cracked, the weight of her regret pouring out with every word. John looked at her for a long moment, his expression still unreadable. "I know you're sorry, but it doesn't change anything," he said quietly. "You've already made your choices, Sophie. You have to live with that now. I've lived with mine, and I'm moving on." Sophie sat there in stunned silence, her heart aching with the unbearable truth. The man she had loved, the man she had hurt beyond measure, was gone, and all that was left was the silence. The callousness of truth had shattered everything. The days that followed the cafe meeting were a blur of emotion for Sophie. She had been living in a fog of regret, constantly haunted by the image of John walking away from her, the finality in his voice echoing in her mind. It felt like everything had slipped through her fingers, and all she had left was the emptiness he left behind. Yet, despite all the pain, a small, persistent voice inside her kept telling her that there might still be a way back. Maybe, just maybe, she could fix it. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized the extent of her mistakes. John wasn't just a man she had betrayed. He had been the foundation of her life. He had trusted her, loved her, and given her everything, and she had thrown it all away. The thought of trying to patch things up now seemed almost insulting, like slapping a Band-Aid on a wound that needed stitches. But then, there was Mark. She had been holding on to the hope that he might offer her something more, that he might be the escape she so desperately needed. But with his message weeks ago, "I can't do this anymore," he had shut the door, leaving her to face the cold reality of what she had lost. He wasn't coming back. Sophie couldn't even bring herself to reach out to him again. It had become clear that Mark was never going to be the answer. He had been a distraction, a way to avoid facing the mess she had made of her life. But now she was back to where she started, alone. The weight of the truth, of everything she had done, pressed on her with a suffocating force. She had always been able to manipulate situations, to play the game in a way that suited her. But now the game had turned on her. She was trapped in her own choices, and there was no way out. One evening, after hours of pacing around her apartment, Sophie decided to take action. She had to try. She had to find a way to make things right, or at least find some closure. She couldn't live with this constant ache of knowing she had ruined everything. She had to see John again. She had to hear it from him one more time, that she was truly lost to him. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and texted him, "I need to see you, please. Just one more chance to talk." Her hands shook as she hit send, and she waited. Minutes passed, and nothing. She stared at the screen, hoping for some sign, some response, but it never came. The silence between them was unbearable. It was the silence that had killed everything, and it seemed like it was all she would ever get from John now. Then, out of nowhere, her phone buzzed. A new message from John. "Come to the park tomorrow, noon, we'll talk." Sophie's heart raced. The park, the place where they had shared so many memories, where they had once walked hand in hand, their future so full of promise. It felt like a cruel joke now. The next day, Sophie arrived early. She paced around the park, unsure of what to expect. She had no idea what John would say to her, whether he was willing to give her another chance or whether he was simply going to end it once and for all. But she had to know. When he arrived, he didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at her with those cold eyes that once held so much love. It hurt more than she could have imagined. The man she had spent years with, the man she had loved, now looked at her like she was a stranger. "I don't know what you expect, Sophie," John finally said, his voice quieter than before. "What's left for us to talk about? You've made your choices, and now you have to live with them." Sophie's chest tightened. The words hit her harder than she thought possible. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg him for forgiveness, but she knew deep down that it wouldn't change anything. John had already made up his mind. "I'm sorry, John," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I know I've destroyed everything, but I can't undo it. All I can do is ask you to forgive me." John took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm not the one you should be asking for forgiveness, Sophie," he said quietly. "You need to forgive yourself, because no matter how sorry you are, you can't change what's been done. You can't go back." The words were like a slap to the face. They were true, undeniable, and they stung more than anything he could have said. Sophie felt her heart shatter even further, realizing that the man she had betrayed had found a peace that she would never have. "I've already moved on," John continued, his tone steady but firm. "You need to, too." Sophie stood there, frozen, the weight of his words settling into her bones. She wanted to scream, to cry, to beg him to give her one more chance. But she knew, deep down, that it was over. The game had ended, and she had lost. As John turned and walked away, Sophie felt the emptiness consume her completely. She had lost everything. Her marriage, her family, her future. And there was no way to take it back. Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the phone in her hands, the same phone she had used to hide her lies, to deceive John. It had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in her life. The messages from Mark, the secret calls, the lies she told herself and everyone around her, each one had brought her here to this moment of reckoning. Her heart was heavy, filled with an emptiness that she couldn't escape. She had already lost John. She had already lost Mark. But somehow, as much as she wanted to just close her eyes and pretend it was all a nightmare, the truth was undeniable. The doorbell rang. The sharp sound cut through the thick silence of her apartment. She hesitated before getting up, unsure of what to expect. She didn't want to face anyone, least of all John. But when she saw his name on the door camera, her breath caught in her throat. Sophie didn't know how to react. She wasn't ready for this. Was he coming to yell at her, to say goodbye for good? The thought of him leaving her for good made her feel like the floor was crumbling beneath her feet. She couldn't bear to lose him again, but she knew deep down that she had already lost him. She opened the door slowly, and there he was. John standing in front of her, his face as unreadable as it had been when he left. The pain in his eyes was still there, but now there was something else, exhaustion. It was as if the weight of their entire relationship had worn him down to the point where he no longer had the energy to fight. "John," Sophie's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from the tears she had cried in the past days. She wasn't sure if she wanted him to stay or leave, but the truth was she was terrified. "Sophie," he said, his voice steady, though there was a hint of bitterness beneath the surface. "We need to talk. I've been trying to move on, but I can't. Not until you finally understand what you've done." Sophie's breath hitched, and for a moment she couldn't speak. She had imagined this conversation so many times, but now that it was happening, she didn't know how to handle it. The words she had rehearsed in her head seemed too weak, too meaningless. Nothing could make up for the hurt she had caused him. "I know," she finally said, her voice shaking. "I know what I've done. I know I can never fix it. But please, just let me explain. I never wanted to hurt you, John. I swear." John shook his head, his jaw tightening as if trying to suppress the anger and pain that threatened to surface. "You don't get it, do you, Sophie? This isn't just about a mistake or something that can be forgiven. This was a betrayal. You chose him over me. You threw away everything we had for someone who never meant anything to you." The words struck her like a physical blow. She had known he was angry, but hearing it in his voice, seeing the pain in his eyes, made it real. All the denial she had clung to for so long fell away, leaving only the truth. He was right. She had chosen Mark. She had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and no amount of apologies could change that. "Why?" John's voice cracked, his composure slipping. "Why did you do it? Why did you destroy everything we built together?" Sophie felt her chest tighten. The question had been echoing in her mind for days, and she still didn't have an answer. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was lost. I was looking for something I thought I needed, but now I realize I had everything I ever needed right here with you." John didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, as if trying to make sense of what she was saying. Sophie could see the wall in his eyes, the wall that had grown taller and thicker with each lie she had told, with each betrayal she had committed. He took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. "I wish I could believe you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could believe that you're sorry, that you truly understand what you've done. But I can't. Not anymore." The finality of his words hit Sophie like a freight train. There was no room for redemption here, no space left for forgiveness. She had destroyed their love, their trust, and now she had to live with it. John turned to leave, but before he did, he paused, his back still to her. "You need to live with the truth, Sophie. The truth that you're the one who broke us. You're the one who destroyed what we had." Sophie stood frozen, her heart breaking all over again. She wanted to call out to him, to beg him to stay, but she knew she couldn't. This was the end. The dreaded truth had come crashing down, and there was no going back. As John walked away, Sophie collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with sobs. The weight of her choices, the consequences of her actions were too much to bear. She had lost everything, and now she had nothing left but the truth. Sophie had never felt more alone in her life. The days since John had left her had been nothing but a blur. She spent each hour trapped in her thoughts, replaying the events over and over in her mind. Each time, the sting of betrayal, the emptiness, the guilt, it was all the same. No matter what she did, no matter how much she tried to fix it, everything was broken. But today, something was different. Sophie had finally made a decision. She couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't let the silence between them be the final chapter of their story. There had to be something she could say, something that might make him understand that she was sorry, truly, deeply sorry, and that she wanted to make things right. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. John had already made his decision. She saw the finality in his eyes every time he looked at her. But what did she have to lose? Everything had already been shattered. There was no way to make it worse. Sophie found herself at the same cafe where they had met that fateful day. Her heart was pounding, her hands clammy as she waited for John to arrive. She had no idea how he would react, but she couldn't let this chance slip away. She had to try. The door opened and John stepped in, his presence as commanding as ever. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. He didn't look at her at first, choosing to take a seat at the table without a word. Sophie's stomach churned. the weight of the moment bearing down on her. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. After a long pause, John finally looked up. His eyes were tired, filled with a quiet sadness, but there was no trace of anger anymore, no fire, just a hollow, empty resignation that seemed to fill the space between them. "Sophie," he said, his voice cold, distant, like he was already somewhere else, like he was already moving on from her. "What do you want? What is it that you think is left to say?" Sophie's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "John, I know I've destroyed everything. I can't undo it. I can't take back what I've done. But please, listen. Please, just hear me out." John didn't respond. He just stared at her, waiting for something more. Waiting for her to prove that she understood the depth of her actions, that she understood how badly she had hurt him. "I've been living with the guilt every day," Sophie continued, her voice breaking. "I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you, but I did, and I don't know how to make it right. But I need you to know that I'm truly sorry. I am." John's eyes hardened slightly, but his expression remained unreadable. Sophie's heart was pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears, but she didn't stop. "You say you've been living with the guilt," John said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "What about me, Sophie? I've been living with the reality of your lies, your betrayal. I've been living with the truth that the woman I loved chose someone else over me. You say you're sorry, but how does that change anything? How does that fix what's been broken?" Sophie felt the sting of his words, but they were true. She knew they were true. "I don't expect it to fix everything," she whispered. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just need you to know that I'm sorry, that I regret what I did more than anything in this world." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was suffocating. Sophie could see the walls closing in around them, the distance between them widening. She had never felt so small, so insignificant in his presence. She had shattered him, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. Finally, John spoke again, his voice steady but filled with a depth of emotion that Sophie hadn't heard from him in a long time. "You say you regret it, but do you even understand the magnitude of what you did? Do you understand what you took from me? What we had?" Sophie's chest tightened with the weight of his words. "I do," she whispered. "I know. I understand. And I would give anything to go back and fix it." John leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "But you can't," he said quietly. "You can't go back. You can't fix it. And I can't pretend that things are the same. They're not, and they never will be." Sophie felt the truth in his words cut deep. It wasn't just the end of their relationship. It was the end of everything she had once believed in, everything she had once trusted, and there was no way to take it back. "I've made my peace with it," John continued, his voice softening slightly. "But I can't keep living in this. I can't keep holding on to something that isn't there anymore." Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she realized what he was saying. It was over. Truly over. There was no chance for reconciliation. No chance for them to find their way back to each other. "I know," she whispered, choking on her words. "I know." John stood up, his movements slow but resolute. He took one last look at her, his gaze filled with a sadness that Sophie would never forget. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But this is the last time we'll talk." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sophie alone with the weight of the truth. Sophie stared at the empty apartment around her, the silence louder than ever. John was gone. The finality of it hit her harder than she expected, and now all she could feel was a suffocating void. She had lost him. She had lost everything. Her life, once so carefully constructed, now seemed like a distant memory. All the decisions she had made, all the lies she had told herself to justify her actions, felt like the cruelest trick. She had convinced herself that everything would work out, that she could keep both men in her life and still have everything she wanted. But in the end, she had nothing. Every corner of the apartment felt like a reminder of her failure. The pictures of happier times with John, the little things they had shared, now felt like an insult. They were all lies, lies she had built up to convince herself that she hadn't destroyed their lives. But she had. Her phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Mark, and for a moment her heart skipped. She hadn't heard from him since his abrupt departure. Maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to make sense of everything. Maybe he would give her the answers she was looking for, or maybe, just maybe, he would somehow offer her the chance to redeem herself. But as she read the message, her stomach dropped. "I've moved on. I don't think we should keep in touch. It's better this way." The finality of his words cut deeper than anything John had said. Mark was gone, too. She had lost him as well. Sophie felt like she was drowning in her own guilt, the weight of her actions pulling her down further with each passing minute. How had she let herself fall so far? How had she become the person she never thought she'd be? She had hurt the people who cared about her, and for what? A fleeting moment of selfishness? A momentary escape from the life she had built? Tears welled up in her eyes as she collapsed onto the couch. The regret, the overwhelming, suffocating regret was more than she could handle. Her heart ached as the realization settled in. She had driven John away, destroyed her marriage, and now there was nothing left. She thought back to the last time they had truly been happy, when everything felt right. Those moments seemed so distant now, like a dream she would never be able to reach again. She wished she could go back, make different choices, but time, as always, was unforgiving. The damage was done. She picked up her phone once more, staring at the blank screen as if it might offer some sort of salvation. But it didn't. She had no one left to turn to, no one to confide in. The people she had hurt were gone, and she was left to face the mess she had made. Her thoughts drifted to John. The last time she saw him, his face was a mixture of hurt and resolve. He was done, and Sophie knew it. She had tried to hold on to him, tried to beg for another chance, but it was too late. His heart had hardened, and no amount of apologies could undo the damage. Sophie wiped her eyes, trying to gather herself, but the tears wouldn't stop. Every moment without John felt like an eternity. She couldn't stop thinking about how much she had taken him for granted, how she had let everything slip through her fingers. She had been so selfish, so blinded by her own desires, that she hadn't even seen the destruction she was leaving in her wake. She had thought she could handle it all, Mark, John, her career, everything. But in the end, she couldn't. The truth was too harsh to ignore. She had lost everything, and now she had to live with the consequences. Sophie knew that her journey wasn't over. There was still more to face, more pain to endure, but the weight of it all was almost too much to bear. She had hoped that redemption was still possible, but now the truth was clear. She had already paid the price for her mistakes, and no amount of regret would bring John back. As the evening stretched on, Sophie felt the loneliness settle deeper into her bones. She had no one to blame but herself, and in this silence, the harshest truth of all was finally clear. She was alone. Sophie had spent the days following her final conversation with John in a haze. Each morning she woke to the same crushing emptiness, the same hollow silence. Her apartment, once a home filled with memories, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in around her, echoing with the ghosts of what used to be. She had tried to move forward. She had tried to pick up the pieces of her broken life, but each step felt like walking through quicksand, as if every effort to move forward only sank her deeper into the regret she couldn't escape. She couldn't erase the hurt she had caused, nor could she forget the man she had betrayed. John was gone. Mark was gone. Everyone she had once trusted had left, and now Sophie was left with nothing but the consequences of her own actions. Her phone buzzed with a message, and for a moment she thought it might be John, but it wasn't. It was from her boss, asking her to meet about an urgent project at work. Sophie didn't respond right away. She had barely been keeping up with her job, let alone putting in the effort she used to. But something about the message triggered a sense of urgency in her, a sense that she needed to keep moving, even if it was just for a few hours. She left the apartment, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. The streets outside were busy, the world moving on without her. Sophie tried to distract herself from the gnawing emptiness inside, but it was impossible. Every step she took felt weighted down by the knowledge that she had destroyed everything she had ever cared about. The meeting was brief, and as she sat in her office afterward, alone with her thoughts, she couldn't shake the feeling of overwhelming loss. Her career, once something she had prided herself on, now seemed insignificant. She had nothing left to prove. She had lost John, the man who had been the love of her life, and she had lost herself in the process. The cold truth settled in. She had paid the ultimate price for her mistakes. It wasn't just the end of her marriage or the loss of a relationship with Mark. It was the destruction of the woman she had once been. Sophie had changed, and not for the better. She had become someone she didn't recognize, someone who had betrayed love, trust, and everything that mattered. As the day wore on, Sophie found herself sinking deeper into a pit of despair. She couldn't face the reality of what she had done, but she couldn't escape it either. Every interaction, every memory seemed to remind her of the damage she had caused. The guilt was all-consuming, and there was no way to undo it. That evening, Sophie sat alone in her apartment, staring at the blank screen of her phone. She had reached out to John one last time, but he had responded with the same indifference. It was over. There was no coming back from this. She stood up, her body heavy with the weight of everything she had lost. The truth was undeniable. She had paid the ultimate price. There was no redemption, no second chance. The life she had built, the love she had taken for granted, was gone. Sophie thought back to the early days with John, the days when everything felt so simple, when love seemed effortless. She had been so naive to think that love would always be enough, that it could survive anything. But she had been wrong. She had broken it, and now all she had left was the pain of knowing she had destroyed something beautiful. Her tears fell silently as she sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the weight of her regret. She had been foolish, reckless, and selfish. Now she would have to live with the consequences, knowing that there was no one left to help her pick up the pieces. The ultimate price had been paid, and it was more than she could bear. Sophie sat at the small table in her apartment, the empty coffee cup in front of her a symbol of everything she had lost. The silence around her was suffocating, but it was the only thing left she could rely on. It had been weeks since she last heard from John, weeks since the final confrontation at the cafe, and yet the sting of his words still echoed in her mind, louder than ever. "You've already made your choices." The words rang in her ears like a death sentence. She had made her choices, and she was living with the consequences. There was no going back, no second chance. She had lost him, and there was no one left to blame but herself. Her phone sat next to the coffee cup, silent as ever. She had stopped checking it so obsessively. The hopelessness had sunk in, and she knew that no message, no call would ever change what had already been set into motion. She was alone, completely alone. Sophie had tried everything to distract herself. She had thrown herself into her work, hoping that it would numb the pain. But it didn't work. Nothing did. The pain of losing John, of betraying him, was always there, lurking in the background, like a shadow that never left. It followed her everywhere, taunting her, reminding her of the wreckage she had caused. The truth had settled in, deeper than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't just the loss of her marriage, her family. It was the loss of herself. She had betrayed the one person who had truly loved her, and now there was no coming back from that. She stood up from the table and walked to the window. The city outside moved on without her. People walked by, engaged in their own lives, completely unaware of the storm that raged inside her. She watched them for a moment, wishing she could be like them, unaffected, oblivious to the weight of regret that pressed down on her chest. Sophie's eyes drifted to the park where she and John had spent so many afternoons together. The place that had once been their haven was now just another reminder of what she had lost. She thought back to the laughter, the long walks, the way his hand had always felt so natural in hers. Those moments felt like they belonged to someone else, someone she had lost a long time ago. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Who could it be? She walked slowly to the door, her stomach twisting with uncertainty. When she opened it, she was surprised to find Julia standing there, her face a mixture of concern and hesitation. "Julia," Sophie said, her voice breaking slightly. "What are you doing here?" I couldn't stay away anymore," Julia said softly. "I've been trying to give you space, but I couldn't just let you go through this alone." Sophie felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone, anyone, to reach out to her. But even as Julia stepped inside, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late. Too late for any kind of comfort. Too late for any kind of redemption. "John's gone, Julia," Sophie whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "And I don't think he'll ever come back. He's made his choice, and I made mine." Julia placed a hand gently on Sophie's shoulder, but Sophie could see the sorrow in her eyes. She knew it too. There was nothing anyone could say to make this right. Sophie had burned every bridge, and now she was left standing in the ruins of her own making. "I know," Julia said, her voice soft but firm. "But you can still heal. You can still try to find yourself again. It's not over, Sophie. But you have to be willing to face the truth, to accept what's happened, and start moving forward." Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her like an anchor. Could she move forward? Could she ever move past this? Or was she destined to live in the shadow of her own betrayal for the rest of her life? She didn't know. All she knew was that for the first time in a long while, someone was there for her. But even that wasn't enough to fill the emptiness inside. "I don't know how to fix this," Sophie whispered, her voice filled with desperation. "I don't know where to go from here." Julia didn't have an answer. She didn't need to. Sophie knew that the only person who could fix it was herself, but she wasn't sure she had the strength to do it. As Julia sat with her, the weight of the silence between them felt almost as heavy as the silence that had existed between Sophie and John for so long. But for the first time, Sophie allowed herself to feel something other than regret. She allowed herself to feel the small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she could start to heal. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But in that moment, Sophie understood that the final act of silence wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something else, the beginning of a long journey, one that, no matter how painful, she had to take on her own. Sophie woke up to the same emptiness that had consumed her for weeks. Each day she stumbled through life, barely able to focus on anything. The regret she had been living with wasn't just a fleeting feeling, it was a permanent weight, one she couldn't shake off no matter how hard she tried. The repercussions of her actions were undeniable, and they were everywhere she looked. John was gone, of course, but so much more had been lost in the wake of her betrayal. Her relationships with friends, once strong and trusting, had started to fray as well. Julia had been there for her, yes, but the truth was, Julia had her own life, her own responsibilities. Sophie couldn't ask her to shoulder the burden of her mistakes. Work had become another struggle. Sophie had always prided herself on her dedication and ambition, but now it was just another reminder of the hollow shell she had become. Her colleagues had stopped looking at her the same way. They were polite, distant, and Sophie knew they whispered about her behind her back. Her phone remained silent. No messages from John, no texts from Mark. She had reached out to both of them, but as each day passed, the silence became louder, more suffocating. The only response she ever got was from Mark's final message, "I can't do this anymore." She had thought there might be a sliver of hope left, that somehow she could fix it, salvage something from the wreckage. But she knew better now. Her attempts to reach out had only resulted in more silence. And now Sophie was left with the brutal truth. She had ruined everything. It wasn't just that she had lost John, or that Mark was gone, or even the disconnection she felt with her colleagues and friends. It was the loss of herself. The woman she had once been, the woman who believed in love, in honesty, in second chances, was gone. She had chosen to betray those ideals, and now she had to live with the fact that she had become someone she didn't recognize. One evening, as Sophie walked through the now empty apartment, she couldn't help but remember the way it used to feel. She had once seen this place as a sanctuary, a home filled with love and laughter, but now it was a hollow shell. Every room was a reminder of the person she had been, and the person she had become. The walls felt closer, the air thicker, as if the apartment itself was mourning the loss of something real. Sophie sank onto the couch, her head in her hands, as tears spilled from her eyes once again. She thought about the countless nights she had spent with John, the conversations they'd shared, the dreams they had built together, and now it was all shattered. The remorse she felt wasn't just because she had hurt John, it was because she had lost the one thing that had made her feel truly alive, the connection she had with him. No one else could replace that. No amount of time or distance would ever heal the wound she had inflicted on herself and on him. She had thought that if she could fix things with John, if she could make things right, she might be able to regain some semblance of control over her life. But now she understood that there was no fixing this. The damage was too deep. She had to accept it, to live with the consequences of her choices. The quiet of the apartment felt like a punishment. Sophie had wanted to scream, to reach out to someone, anyone, but she couldn't. No one would understand. No one could take away the pain she had caused herself. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. But even in that painful realization, Sophie knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Moving forward was going to be her only option. She couldn't stay stuck in the past, couldn't continue to drown in regret. But as she sat there in the emptiness of her own mind, she wondered if she would ever be able to forgive herself. Would the silence ever stop? Would she ever feel whole again? Or was this the price she would pay for the rest of her life? Sophie closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely, knowing that she had already paid a steep price. And though she didn't know where the road ahead would lead, she understood that she would have to walk it alone. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall was deafening. Sophie sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the floor, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her chest. The apartment around her was silent, too silent. It was the silence of someone who had given up, someone who had accepted that no words could undo the damage, no plea could change the past. She hadn't heard from John in weeks, not a text, not a call. He had made it clear that there was nothing left to say. The finality of his departure had sunk in completely. She had no more chances to make it right, no more chances to apologize, to explain herself. All she had now was the painful truth that she had destroyed the one good thing in her life. The silence was now permanent, just like the void he had left. Sophie glanced at the small pile of letters on the table in front of her, unopened and untouched. Among them there were a few from work, things she had no energy to deal with, and others from people who once cared. But the one that caught her attention the most was from her lawyer. She had considered opening it, but she already knew what it would say. The divorce papers had been finalized, her marriage was officially over, and it had been her doing. A deep, hollow feeling settled in her stomach. The finality of it hit her hard, harder than she had ever expected. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It wasn't just the loss of a partner. It was the end of a dream, the dream of a life that had seemed so perfect, so complete. Sophie had ruined that life with a moment of weakness, with selfish decisions that she couldn't take back. She had been the one to break everything, and now she had to live with the consequences, the constant ache of regret, the realization that she would never feel the same way again. It was unbearable. She didn't know how to face the world anymore. She had built so much of her identity around John, around the life they had created. And now it was gone. The days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. Sophie had no motivation left, no drive to continue. The guilt had consumed her entirely. She had lost John, and in losing him she had lost herself. The woman she had once been, the woman who could laugh and love freely, was gone. Now she was just a shell, trapped in her own regret. There were moments when she thought about calling him, begging him to listen, to give her one last chance. But the thought was fleeting. Deep down she knew that it was pointless. John had made his decision. He had moved on, and Sophie was left in the dust, carrying the weight of the mistakes she had made. She was too far gone to ever be forgiven. Sophie stood up slowly, walking to the window. She looked out at the world beyond, the city bustling with life, unaware of the quiet pain she was drowning in. The life she had once been a part of now seemed so distant, so unreachable. She had built so many hopes, so many dreams, only to have them slip through her fingers. She thought back to their last conversation, to John's final words. "It's too late for us. You've already made your choices." She had begged him to stay, begged him to give her another chance, but his response had been cold. "I can't look at you the same way anymore." Sophie couldn't forget the emptiness in his eyes when he said that. It was the death of everything she had hoped for, everything she had believed in. Her phone buzzed on the counter and she automatically glanced at it, hoping for a message, any message. But it was just another notification from her work. She sighed, tossing the phone back onto the table. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered. The weight of the silence settled in her bones. It was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the absence of everything. The absence of love. The absence of trust. The absence of a future she had taken for granted. And now, all she had left was the empty apartment, the remnants of a life that had been destroyed by her own hand. Sophie walked back to the couch, her eyes finally landing on the divorce papers once again. She picked them up, staring at the words in front of her. Divorce finalized. The reality of it struck her hard, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. It wasn't the first tear she had shed, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But for the first time she felt a small flicker of something deeper than regret. It was acceptance. The truth was, Sophie had been given the chance to change, to make things right. She had thrown it all away, but now there was no more fighting, no more bargaining. There was only the silence, the end. And with that, Sophie knew that it was finally time to stop fighting the inevitable. The end had come, and all she could do now was accept it.